Preface. These pages, which introduce Pedagogy of the Oppressed, result from my observations during 6 years of political exile. Observations which have enriched those previously afforded by my educational activities in Brazil. I have encountered, both in training courses which analyze the role of conscientizaco and in actual experimentation with a truly liberating education, the Freire of freedom discussed in the first chapter of this book. Not infrequently, training course participants call attention to the danger of conscientizaco in a way that reveals their own fear of freedom. Critical consciousness, they say, is anarchic. Others add that critical consciousness may lead to disorder. Some, however, confess, "Why deny it? I was afraid of freedom, and I am no longer afraid." In one of these discussions, the group was debating whether the conscientizaco of men and women to a specific situation of injustice might not lead them to destructive fanaticism, or to a sensation of total collapse of their world. In the midst of the argument, a person who previously had been a factory worker for many years spoke out. "Perhaps I am the only one here of working-class origin. I can't say that I have understood everything you've said just now, but I can say one thing. When I began this course, I was naive, and when I found out how naive I was, I started to get critical. But this discovery hasn't made me a fanatic, and I don't feel any collapse either." Doubt regarding the possible effects of conscientizaco implies a premise, which the doubter doesn't always make explicit. It is better for the victims of injustice not to recognize themselves as such. In fact, however, conscientizaco doesn't lead people to destructive fanaticism. On the contrary, by making it possible for people to enter the historical process as responsible subjects, conscientizaco enrolls them in the search for self-affirmation and thus avoids fanaticism. Quote, "The awakening of critical consciousness leads the way to the expression of social discontents precisely because these discontents are real components of an oppressive situation." End of the quote. Fear of freedom, of which its possessor is not necessarily aware, makes him see ghosts. Such an individual is actually taking refuge in an attempt to achieve security, which he or she prefers to the risks of liberty. As Hegel testifies, it is solely by risking life that freedom is obtained. The individual who has not staked his or her life may no doubt be recognized as a person, but he or she hasn't attained the truth of this recognition as an independent self-consciousness. End of the quote. Men and women rarely admit their fear of freedom openly, however, tending rather to camouflage it, sometimes unconsciously, by presenting themselves as defenders of freedom. They give their doubts and misgivings an air of profound sobriety, as befitting custodians of freedom. But they confuse freedom with the maintenance of the status quo, so that if conscientizaco threatens to place the status quo in question, it thereby seems to constitute a threat to freedom itself. Thought and study alone didn't produce pedagogy of the oppressed. It is rooted in concrete situations and describes the reactions of laborers, peasant or urban, and of middle-class persons whom I have observed directly or indirectly during the course of my educative work. Continued observation will afford me an opportunity to modify or to corroborate in later studies the points proposed in this introductory work. This volume will probably arouse negative reactions in a number of readers. Some will regard my position vis-à-vis the problem of human liberation is purely idealistic, or may even consider discussion of ontological vocation, love, dialogue, hope, humility, and sympathy as so much reactionary blah. Others will not, or will not wish to, accept my denunciation of a state of oppression that gratifies the oppressors. Accordingly, this admittedly tentative work is for radicals. I am certain that Christians and Marxists, though they may disagree with me in part or in whole, will continue reading to the end. But the reader who dogmatically assumes closed, irrational positions will reject the dialogue I hope this book will open. Sectarianism fed by fanaticism is always castrating. Radicalization nourished by a critical spirit is always creative. Sectarianism mythicizes and thereby alienates. Radicalization criticizes and thereby liberates. Radicalization involves increased commitment to the position one has chosen, and thus ever greater engagement in the effort to transform concrete, objective reality. Conversely, sectarianism, because it is mythicizing and irrational, turns reality into a false and therefore unchangeable reality. In brackets. Sectarianism in any quarter is an obstacle to the emancipation of mankind. The rightist version thereof doesn't always, unfortunately, call forth its natural counterpart, radicalization of the revolutionary. Not infrequently, revolutionaries themselves become reactionary by falling into sectarianism in the process of responding to the sectarianism of the right. This possibly, however, shouldn't lead the radical to become a docile pawn of the elites. Engaged in the process of liberation, he or she cannot remain passive in the face of the oppressor's violence. On the other hand, the radical is never a subjectivist. For this individual, the subjective aspect exists only in relation to the objective aspect, so the concrete reality, which is the object of analysis. Subjectivity and objectivity thus join in a dialectical unity, producing knowledge in solidarity with action and vice versa. For his or her part, the sectarian of whatever persuasion, blinded by irrationality, doesn't or cannot perceive the dynamic of reality, or else misinterprets it. Should this person think dialectically, it is with a domesticated dialectic. The rightist sectarian, whom I have previously termed a born sectarian, wants to slow down the historical process, to domesticate time, and thus to domesticate men and women. The leftist turned sectarian goes totally astray when he or she attempts to interpret reality and history dialectically and falls into essentially fatalistic positions. This rightist and this leftist are both reactionary, because, starting from their respectively false views of history, both develop forms of action that negate freedom. The fact that one person imagines a well-behaved present and the other a predetermined future doesn't mean that they therefore fold their arms and become spectators, though the former expecting that the present will continue and the latter waiting for the already known future to come to pass. On the contrary, closing themselves into circles of certainty from which they cannot escape, these individuals make their own truth. It is not the truth of men and women who struggle to build a future, running the risks involved in this very construction. Nor is it the truth of men and women who fight side by side and learn together how to build this future, which is not something given to be received by people, but it's rather something to be created by them. Both types of sectarian, treating history in an equally proprietary fashion, end up without the people, which is another way of being against them. Whereas the rightist sectarian, closing himself in his truth, doesn't more than fulfill a natural role. The leftist who becomes sectarian and rigid negates his or her very nature. Each, however, as he revolves about his truth, feels threatened if that truth is questioned. Thus, each considers anything that is not his truth a lie. As the journalist Marcio Moreira Alves once told me, quote, "They both suffer from an absence of doubt." End of quote. The radical, committed to human liberation, doesn't become the prisoner of a circle of certainty within which reality is also imprisoned. On the contrary, the more radical the person is, the more fully he or she enters into reality, so that, knowing it better, he or she can better transform it. This individual is not afraid to confront, to listen, to see the world unveiled. This person is not afraid to meet the people or to enter into dialogue with them. This person doesn't consider himself or herself the appropriator of history or of all people, or the liberator of the oppressed, but he or she does commit himself or herself within history to fight at their side. The pedagogy of the oppressed, the introductory outlines of which are presented in the following pages, is a task for radicals. It cannot be carried out by sectarians. I will be satisfied if among the readers of this work there are those sufficiently critical to correct mistakes and misunderstandings, to deepen affirmations, and to point out aspects I have not perceived. It is possible that some may question my right to discuss revolutionary cultural action, a subject of which I have no concrete experience. The fact that I haven't personally participated in revolutionary action, however, doesn't negate the possibility of my reflecting on this theme. Furthermore, in my experience as an educator with the people, using a dialogical and problem-posing education, I have accumulated a comparative wealth of material that challenged me to run the risk of making the affirmations contained in this work. From these pages, I hope at least the following will endure: my trust in the people and my faith in men and women, and in the creation of a world in which it will be easier to love. Here I would like to express my gratitude to Elsa, my wife and first reader, for the understanding and encouragement she has shown my work, which belongs to her as well. I would also like to extend my thanks to a group of friends for their comments on my manuscript. At the risk of omitting some names, I must mention João de Veiga Coutinho, Richard Scholl, Jim Lamp, Mira and Jovino Ramos, Paulo de Tarso, Almina Afonso, Plinia Sampiao, Hernani Maria Fiori, Marcelo Gajardo, José Luis Fiori, and João Zaccariotti. The responsibility for the affirmations made herein is, of course, mine alone. Paulo Freire. Chapter 1. While the problem of humanization has always, from an axiological point of view, been humankind's central problem, it now takes on the character of an inescapable concern. Concern for humanization leads at once to the recognition of dehumanization, not only as an ontological possibility, but as an historical reality. And as an individual perceives the extent of dehumanization, he or she may ask if humanization is a viable possibility. Within history, in concrete objective contexts, both humanization and dehumanization are possibilities for a person, as an uncompleted being conscious of their incompletion. But while both humanization and dehumanization are real alternatives, only the first is the people's vocation. This vocation is constantly negated, yet it is affirmed by that very negation. It is thwarted by injustice, exploitation, oppression, and the violence of the oppressors. It is affirmed by the yearning of the oppressed for freedom and justice, and by their struggle to recover their lost humanity. Dehumanization, which marks not only those whose humanity has been stolen, but also, though in a different way, those who have stolen it, is a distortion of the vocation of becoming more fully human. This distortion occurs within history, but it is not an historical vocation. Indeed, to admit of dehumanization as an historical vocation would lead either to cynicism or total despair. The struggle for humanization, for the emancipation of labor, for the overcoming of alienation, for the affirmation of men and women as persons would be meaningless. This struggle is possible only because dehumanization, although a concrete historical fact, is not a given destiny but the result of an unjust order that engenders violence in the oppressors, which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed. Because it is a distortion of being more fully human, Sooner or later, being less human leads the oppressed to struggle against those who made them so. In order for this struggle to have meaning, the oppressed must not, in seeking to regain their humanity, which is a way to create it, become in turn oppressors of the oppressors, but rather restorers of the humanity of both. This then is the great humanistic and historical task of the oppressed, to liberate themselves and their oppressors as well. The oppressors who oppress, exploit, and rape by virtue of their power cannot find in this power the strength to liberate either the oppressed or themselves. Only power that springs from the weakness of the oppressed will be sufficiently strong to free both. Any attempt to soften the power of the oppressor in deference to the weakness of the oppressed almost always manifests itself in the form of false generosity. Indeed, the attempt never goes beyond this. In order to have the continued opportunity to express their generosity, the oppressors must perpetuate injustice as well. An unjust social order is the permanent fount of this generosity, which is nourished by death, despair, and poverty. That is why the dispensers of false generosity become desperate at the slightest threat to its source. True generosity consists precisely in fighting to destroy the causes which nourish false charity. False charity constrains the fearful and subdued, the rejects of life, to extend their trembling hands. True generosity lies in striving so that these hands, whether of individuals or entire peoples, need be extended less and less in supplication, so that more and more they become human hands which work and, working, transform the world. This lesson and this apprenticeship must come, however, from the oppressed themselves and from those who are truly solidary with them. As individuals or as peoples, by fighting for the restoration of their humanity, they will be attempting the restoration of true generosity. Who are better prepared than the oppressed to understand the terrible significance of an oppressive society? Who suffer the effects of oppression more than the oppressed? Who can better understand the necessity of liberation? They will not gain this liberation by chance, but through the praxis of their quest for it, through their recognition of the necessity to fight for it. And this fight, because of the purpose given it by the oppressed, will actually constitute an act of love, opposing the lovelessness which lies at the heart of the oppressor's violence, lovelessness even when clothed in false generosity. But almost always, during the initial stage of the struggle, the oppressed, instead of striving for liberation, tend themselves to become oppressors or sub-oppressors. The very structure of their thought has been conditioned by the contradictions of the concrete, existential situation by which they were shaped. Their ideal is to be man, but for them, to be man is to be oppressors. This is their model of humanity. This phenomenon derives from the fact that the oppressed at a certain moment of their existential experience adopt an attitude of adhesion to the oppressor. Under these circumstances, they cannot consider him sufficiently clearly to objectivize him, to discover him outside themselves. This does not necessarily mean that the oppressed are unaware that they are downtrodden, but their perception of themselves as oppressed is impaired by their submersion in the reality of oppression. At this level, their perception of themselves as opposites of the oppressor doesn't yet signify engagement in a struggle to overcome the contradiction. The one pole aspires not to liberation, but to identification with its opposite pole. In this situation, the oppressed do not see the new man as the person to be born from the resolution of this contradiction, as oppression gives way to liberation. For them, the new man or woman themselves become oppressors. Their vision of the new man or woman is individualistic. Because of their identification with the oppressor, they have no consciousness of themselves as persons or as members of an oppressed class. It is not to become free that they want agrarian reform, but in order to acquire land and thus become landowners, or, more precisely, bosses over other workers. It is a rare peasant who, once promoted to overseer, doesn't become more of a tyrant towards his former comrades than the owner himself. This is because the context of the peasant situation, that is oppression, remains unchanged. In this example, the overseer, in order to make sure of his job, must be as tough as the owner, and more so. Thus, is illustrated our previous assertion that during the initial stage of their struggle, the oppressed find in the oppressor their model of manhood. Even revolution, which transforms a concrete situation of oppression by establishing the process of liberation, must confront this phenomenon. Many of the oppressed who directly or indirectly participate in revolution intent, conditioned by the myths of the old order, to make it their private revolution. The shadow of their former oppressor is still cast over them. The fear of freedom which afflicts the oppressed, a fear which may equally well lead them to desire the role of oppressor or bind them to the role of oppressed, should be examined. One of the basic elements of the relationship between oppressor and oppressed is prescription. Every prescription represents the imposition of one individual's choice upon another, transforming the consciousness of the person prescribed to into one that conforms with the prescriber's consciousness. Thus, the behavior of the oppressed is a prescribed behavior, following as it does the guidelines of the oppressor. The oppressed, having internalized the image of the oppressor and adopted his guidelines, are fearful of freedom. Freedom would require them to eject this image and replace it with autonomy and responsibility. Freedom is acquired by conquest, not by gift. It must be pursued constantly and responsibly. Freedom is not an ideal located outside of man, nor is it an idea which becomes myth. It is rather the indispensable condition for the quest for human completion. To surmount the situation of oppression, people must first critically recognize its causes, so that through transforming action they can create a new situation, one which makes possible the pursuit of fuller humanity. But the struggle to be more fully human has already begun in the authentic struggle to transform the situation. Although the situation of oppression is a dehumanized and dehumanizing totality affecting both the oppressors and those whom they oppress, it is the latter who must, from their stifled humanity, wage for both the struggle for a fuller humanity. The oppressor, who is himself dehumanized because he dehumanizes others, is unable to lead this struggle. However, the oppressed who have adapted to the structure of domination in which they are immersed and have become resigned to it are inhibited from waging the struggle for freedom so long as they feel incapable of running the risks it requires. Moreover, their struggle for freedom threatens not only the oppressor, but also their own oppressed comrades, who are fearful of still greater repression. When they discover within themselves the yearning to be free, they perceive that this yearning can be transformed into reality only when the same yearning is aroused in their comrades. But while dominated by fear of freedom, they refuse to appeal to others, or to listen to the appeals of others, or even to the appeals of their own conscience. They prefer gregariousness to authentic comradeship. They prefer the security of conformity with their state of unfreedom to the creative communion produced by freedom, and even the very pursuit of freedom. The oppressed suffer from the duality which has established itself in their innermost being. They discover that without freedom they cannot exist authentically. Yet, although they desire authentic existence, they fear it. They are at one and the same time themselves and the oppressor whose consciousness they have internalized. The conflict lies in the choice between being wholly themselves or being divided, between ejecting the oppressor within or not ejecting them, between human solidarity or alienation, between following prescriptions or having choices, between being spectators or actors, between acting or having the illusion of acting through the action of the oppressors, between speaking out and being silent, castrated in their power to create and recreate, in their power to transform the world. This is the tragic dilemma of the oppressed which their education must take into account. This book will present some aspects of what the writer has termed the pedagogy of the oppressed, a pedagogy which must be forged with, not for, the oppressed, whether individuals or peoples, in the incessant struggle to regain their humanity. This pedagogy makes oppression and its causes objects of reflection by the oppressed, and from the reflection will come their necessary engagement in the struggle for their liberation. And in the struggle, this pedagogy will be made and remade. The central problem is this: how can the oppressed, as divided, unauthentic beings, participate in developing the pedagogy of their liberation? Only as they discover themselves to be hosts of the oppressor can they contribute to the midwifery of their liberating pedagogy. As long as they live in the duality in which to be is to be like, and to be like is to be like the oppressor, this contribution is impossible. The pedagogy of the oppressed is an instrument for their critical discovery that both they and the oppressors are manifestations of dehumanization. Liberation is thus a childbirth, and a painful one. The man or woman who emerges in a new person, viable only as the oppressor-oppressed contradiction, is superseded by the humanization of all people. Or to put it another way, the solution of this contradiction is born in the labor which brings into the world this new being, no longer oppressor, no longer oppressed, but human, in the process of achieving freedom. This solution cannot be achieved in idealistic terms. In order for the oppressed to be able to wage the struggle for their liberation, they must perceive the reality of oppression, not as a closest world from which there is no exit, but as a limited situation which they can transform. This perception is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for liberation. It must become the motivating force for liberating action. Nor does the discovery by the oppressed that they exist in a dialectical relationship to the oppressor as his antithesis, that without them the oppressor could not exist, in itself constitute liberation. The oppressed can overcome the contradiction in which they are caught only when the perception enlists them in the struggle to free themselves. The same is true with respect to the individual oppressor as a person. Discovering himself to be an oppressor may cause considerable anguish, but it does not necessarily lead to solidarity with the oppressed. Rationalizing his guilt through paternalistic treatment of the oppressed, all the while holding them fast in a position of dependence, will not do. Solidarity requires that one enter into the situation of those with whom one is solidary. It is a radical posture. If what characterizes the oppressed is their subordination to the consciousness of the master, as Hegel affirms, true solidarity with the oppressed means fighting at their side to transform the objective reality which has made them those beings for another. The oppressor is solidary with the oppressed only when he stops regarding the oppressed as an abstract category and sees them as persons who have been unjustly dealt with, deprived of their voice, cheated in the sale of their labor, when he stops making pious, sentimental, and individualistic gestures and risks an act of love. True solidarity is found only in the plenitude of this act of love, in its existentiality, in its praxis. To affirm that men and women are persons and as persons should be free, and yet to do nothing tangible to make this affirmation a reality, is a farce. Since it is a concrete situation that the oppressor-oppressed contradiction is established, the resolution of this contradiction must be objectively verifiable. Hence, the radical requirement both for the individual who discovers themselves or herself to be an oppressor and for the oppressed, that the concrete situation which begets oppression must be transformed. To present this radical demand for the objective transformation of reality, to combat subjectivist immobility, which would divert the recognition of oppression into patient waiting for oppression to disappear by itself, is not to dismiss the role of subjectivity in the struggle to change structures. On the contrary, one cannot conceive of objectivity without subjectivity. Neither can exist without the other, nor can they be dichotomized. The separation of objectivity from subjectivity, the denial of the latter, when analyzing reality or acting upon it, is objectivism. On the other hand, the denial of objectivity in analysis or action, resulting in a subjectivism which leads to solipsistic positions, denies action itself by denying objective reality. Neither objectivism nor subjectivism, nor yet psychologism is propounded here, but rather subjectivity and objectivity in constant dialectical relationship. To deny the importance of subjectivity in the process of transforming the world in history is naive and simplistic. It is to admit the impossible, a world without people. This objectivistic position is as ingenious as that of subjectivism, which postulates people without a world. World and human beings do not exist apart from each other, they exist in constant interaction. Marx doesn't espouse such a dichotomy, nor does any other critical realistic thinker. What Marx criticized and scientifically destroyed was not subjectivity but subjectivism and psychologism. Just as objective social reality exists not by chance, but as the product of human action, so it is not transformed by chance. If humankind produce social reality, which is, in the inversion of the praxis, turns back upon them and conditions them, then transforming the reality is an historical task, a task for humanity. Reality which becomes oppressive results in the contradistinction of men as oppressors and oppressed. The latter, whose task it is to struggle for their liberation together with those who show true solidarity, must acquire a critical awareness of oppression through the praxis of the struggle. One of the gravest obstacles to the achievement of liberation is that oppressive reality absorbs those within it and thereby acts to submerge human beings' consciousness. Functionally, oppression is domesticating. To no longer be prey to its force, one must emerge from it and turn upon it. This can be done only by means of the praxis, reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. Making real oppression more oppressive, still by adding to it the realization of oppression, corresponds to the dialectical relation between the subjective and the objective. Only in the interdependence is an authentic praxis possible, without which it is impossible to resolve the oppressor-oppressed contradiction. To achieve this goal, the oppressed must confront reality critically, simultaneously objectifying and acting upon that reality. A mere perception of reality, not followed by this critical intervention, will not lead to a transformation of objective reality, precisely because it is not a true perception. This is the case of a purely subjectivist perception by someone who forsakes objective reality and creates a false substitute. A different type of false perception occurs when a change in objective reality would threaten the individual or class interests of the perceiver. In the first instance, there is no critical intervention in reality because the reality is fictitious. There is none in the second instance because intervention would contradict the class interests of the perceiver. In the latter case, the tendency of the perceiver is to behave neurotically. The fact exists, but both the fact and what may result from it may be prejudicial to the person. Thus it becomes necessary not precisely to deny the fact, but to see it differently. The rationalization as a defense mechanism coincides in the end with subjectivism. A fact which is not denied but whose truths are rationalized loses its objective base. It ceases to be concrete and becomes a myth created in defense of the class of the perceiver. Herein lies one of the reasons for the prohibitions and the difficulties, designed to dissuade the people from critical intervention in reality. The oppressor knows full well that this intervention would not be to his interest. What is to his interest is for the people to continue in a state of submersion, impotent in the face of oppressive reality. In affirming this necessity, Lucas is unquestionably posing the problem of critical intervention. To exploit to the masses their own action is to clarify and illuminate that action, both regarding its relationship to the objective facts by which it was prompted and regarding its purposes. The more the people unveil this challenging reality, which is to be the object of their transforming action, the more critically they enter that reality. In this way, they are consciously activating the subsequent development of their experiences. There would be no human action if there were no objective reality, no world to be the not I of the person and to challenge them, just as there would be no human action if humankind were not a project, if he or she were not able to transcend himself or herself, if one were not able to perceive reality and understand it in order to transform it. In dialectical thought, world and action are intimately interdependent. But action is human only when it is not merely an occupation but also a preoccupation, that is, when it is not dichotomized from reflection. Reflection, which is essential to action, is implicit in Lucas' requirement of explaining to the masses their own action, just as it is implicit in the purpose he attributes to his explanation, that of consciously activating the subsequent development of experience. For us, however, the requirement is seen not in terms of explaining to, but rather dialoguing with the people about their actions. In any event, no reality transforms itself, and the duty which Lucas ascribes to the Revolutionary Party of explaining to the masses their own action coincides with our affirmation of the need for the critical intervention of the people in reality through praxis, the pedagogy of the oppressed, which is the pedagogy of people engaged in the fight for their own liberation, has its roots here. And those who recognize or begin to recognize themselves as oppressed must be among the developers of this pedagogy. No pedagogy which is truly liberating can remain distant from the oppressed by treating them as unfortunates and by presenting for their emulation models from among the oppressors. The oppressed must be their own example in the struggle for their redemption. The pedagogy of the oppressed, animated by authentic humanist, not humanitarian generosity, presents itself as a pedagogy of humankind. Pedagogy which begins with the egoistic interests of the oppressors, an egoism cloaked in the false generosity of paternalism, and makes of the oppressed the objects of its humanitarianism, itself maintains and embodies oppression. It is an instrument of dehumanization. This is why, as we affirmed earlier, the pedagogy of the oppressed cannot be developed or practiced by the oppressors. It would be a contradiction in terms if the oppressors not only defended but actually implemented a liberating education. But if the implementation of a liberating education requires political power and the oppressed have none, how then it is possible to carry out the pedagogy of the oppressed prior to the revolution? This is a question of the greatest importance, the reply to which is at least tentatively outlined in Chapter 4. One aspect of the reply is to be found in the distinction between systematic education, which can only be changed by political power, and educational projects, which should be carried out with the oppressed in the process of organizing them. The pedagogy of the oppressed as a humanist and libertarian pedagogy has two distinct stages. In the first, the oppressed unveil the world of oppression and through the praxis commit themselves to its transformation. In the second stage, in which the reality of oppression has already been transformed, this pedagogy ceases to belong to the oppressed and becomes a pedagogy of all people in the process of permanent liberation. In both stages, it is always through action in depth that the culture of domination is culturally confronted. In the first stage, this confrontation occurs through the change in the way the oppressed perceive the world of oppression. In the second stage, through the explosion of the mess created and developed in the old order, which like specters haunt the new structure emerging from the revolutionary transformation. The pedagogy of the first stage must deal with the problem of the oppressed consciousness and the oppressor consciousness, the problem of men and women who oppress and men and women who suffer oppression. It must take into account their behavior, their view of the world, and their ethics. A particular problem is the duality of the oppressed. They are contradictory, divided beings, shaped by and existing in a concrete situation of oppression and violence. Any situation in which A objectively exploits B or hinders his and her pursuit of self-affirmation as a responsible person is one of the oppression. Such a situation in itself constitutes violence, even when sweetened by false generosity, because it interferes with the individual's ontological and historical vocation to be more fully human. With the establishment of a relationship of oppression, violence has already begun. Never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed. How could they be the initiators if they themselves are the result of violence? How could they be the sponsors of something whose objective inauguration called forth their existence as oppressed? There would be no oppressed had there been no prior situation of violence to establish their subjugation. Violence is initiated by those who oppress, who exploit, who fail to recognize others as persons, not by those who are oppressed, exploited, and unrecognized. It is not the unloved who initiate disaffection, but those who cannot love because they love only themselves. It is not the helpless, subject to terror, who initiate terror, but the violent, who with their power create the concrete situation which begets the rejects of life. It is not the tyrannized who initiate despotism, but the tyrants. It is not the despised who initiate hatred, but those who despise. It is not those whose humanity is denied them who negate humankind, but those who deny that humanity, thus negating their own as well. Force is used not by those who have become weak under the preponderance of the strong, but by the strong who have emasculated them. For the oppressors, however, it is always the oppressed, whom they obviously never call the oppressed, but depending on whether they are fellow countrymen or not, those people or the blind and envious masses, or savages or natives or subversives, who are disaffected, who are violent, barbaric, wicked or ferocious, when they react to the violence of the oppressors. Yes, it is, paradoxical though it may seem, precisely in the response of the oppressed to the violence of the oppressors that a gesture of love may be found. Consciously or unconsciously, the act of rebellion by the oppressed, an act which is always or nearly always as violent as the initial violence of the oppressors, can initiate love, whereas the violence of the oppressors prevents the oppressed from being fully human. The response of the latter to this violence is grounded in the desire to pursue the right to be human. As the oppressors dehumanize others and violate their rights, they themselves also become dehumanized. As the oppressed, fighting to be human, take away the oppressor's power to dominate and suppress, they restore to the oppressors the humanity they had lost in the exercise of oppression. It is only the oppressed who, by freeing themselves, can free their oppressors. The latter, as an oppressive class, can free neither others nor themselves. It is therefore essential that the oppressed wage the struggle to resolve the contradiction in which they are caught, and the contradiction will be resolved by the appearance of the new man, neither oppressor nor oppressed, but man in the process of liberation. If the goal of the oppressed is to become fully human, they will not achieve their goal by merely revising the terms of the contradiction, by simply changing roles. This may seem simplistic. It is not. Resolution of the oppression-oppressed contradiction indeed implies the disappearance of the oppressors as a dominant class. However, the restraints imposed by the former oppress and their oppressors so that the latter cannot reassume their former position do not constitute oppression. An act is oppressive only when it prevents people from being more fully human. Accordingly, these necessary restraints do not in themselves signify that yesterday's oppressed have become today's oppressors. Acts which prevent the restoration of the oppressive regime cannot be compared with those which create and maintain it, cannot be compared with those by which a few men and women deny the majority their right to be human. However, the moment the new regime hardens into a dominating bureaucracy, the humanist dimension of the struggle is lost, and it is no longer possible to speak of liberation. Hence our insistence that the authentic solution of the oppressor-oppressed contradiction doesn't lie in a mere reversal of position, in moving from one pole to the other, nor does it lie in the replacement of the former oppressors with new ones who continue to subjugate the oppressed, all in the same name of their liberation. But even when the contradiction is resolved authentically by a new situation established by the liberated laborers, the former oppressors do not feel liberated. On the contrary, they genuinely consider themselves to be oppressed, conditioned by the experience of oppressing others, and a situation other than their former seems to them like oppression. Formerly they could eat, dress, wear shoes, be educated, travel, and hear Beethoven, while millions didn't eat, had no clothes or shoes, neither studied nor traveled, much less listened to Beethoven. And a restriction on this way of life in the name of the rights of the community appears to the former oppressors as a profound violation of their individual rights, although they had no respect for the millions who suffered and died of hunger, pain, sorrow, and despair. For the oppressors there exists only one right, their right to live in peace over against the right, not always even recognized but simply conceded of the oppressed to survival. And they make the concession only because the existence of the oppressed is necessary for their own existence. This behavior, this way of understanding the world and people, which necessarily makes the oppressors resist the installation of a new regime, is explained by their experience as a dominant class. Once a situation of violence and oppression has been established, it endangers an entire way of life and behavior for those who are caught up in it, oppressors and oppressed alike. Both are submerged in this situation and both bear the marks of oppression. Analysis of existential situations of oppression reveals that their inception lay in an act of violence initiated by those with power. This violence as a process is perpetuated from generation to generation of oppressors, who become its heirs and are shaped in its climate. This climate creates in the oppressor a strongly possessive consciousness, possessive of the world and of men and women. Apart from direct, concrete, material possession of the world and of people, the oppressor consciousness could not understand itself, could not even exist. From said of the consciousness that, without such possession, it would lose contact with the world. The oppressor consciousness tends to transform everything surrounding it into an object of its domination. The earth, property, production, the creation of people, people themselves, time, everything is reduced to the status of objects at its disposal. In their unrestrained eagerness to possess, the oppressors develop the conviction that it is possible for them to transform everything into objects of their purchasing power. Hence, their strictly materialistic concept of existence. Money is the measure of all things, and profit the primary goal. For the oppressors, what is worthwhile is to have more, always more, even at the cost of the oppressed having less or having nothing. For them, to be is to have, and to be the class of the haves. As beneficiaries of a situation of oppression, the oppressors cannot perceive that if having is a condition of being, it is necessary condition that all women and men. This is why their generosity is false. Humanity is a thing, and they possess it as an exclusive right, as inherited property. To the oppressor consciousness, the dehumanization of the others, of the people, appears not as the pursuit of humanity, but as subversion. The oppressors do not perceive their monopoly on having more as a privilege which dehumanizes others and themselves. They cannot see that, in the egoistic pursuit of having as a possessing class, they suffocate in their own possessions and no longer are. They merely have. For them, having more is an inalienable right, a right they acquired through their own effort, with their courage to take risks. If others do not have more, it is because they are incompetent and lazy, and worst of all is their unjustifiable ingratitude towards the generous gestures of the dominant class. Precisely because they are ungrateful and envious, the oppressed are regarded as potential enemies who must be watched. It could not be otherwise. If the humanization of the oppressed signifies subversion, so also does their freedom, hence the necessity for constant control. And the more the oppressors control the oppressed, the more they change them into apparently inanimate things. This tendency of the oppressor consciousness to inanimate everything and everyone it encounters in its eagerness to possess unquestionably corresponds with a tendency to sadism. The pleasure in complete domination over another person or other animate creature is the very essence of the sadistic drive. Another way of formulating the same thought is to say that the aim of sadism is to transform a man into a thing, something animate into something inanimate, since by complete and absolute control the living loses one essential quality of life: freedom. Sadistic love is a perverted love, a love of death, not of life. One of the characteristics of the oppressor consciousness and its necrophilic view of the world is the sadism. As the oppressor consciousness, in order to dominate, tries to deter the drive to search, the restlessness, and the creative power which characterize life, it kills life. More and more, the oppressors are using science and technology as unquestionably powerful instruments for their purpose, the maintenance of the oppressive order through manipulation and oppression. The oppressed as objects, as things, have no purposes except those the oppressors prescribe for them. Given the preceding context, another issue of indubitable importance arises: the fact that certain members of the oppressor class join the oppressed in their struggle for liberation, thus moving from one pole of the contradiction to the other. Theirs is a fundamental role and has been so throughout the history of the struggle. It happens, however, that as they cease to be exploiters or indifferent spectators, or simply the heirs of exploitation, and move to the side of the exploited, they almost always bring them the marks of their origin, their prejudices and their deformations, which include a lack of confidence in the people's ability to think, to want, and to know. Accordingly, these adherents to the people's cause constantly run the risk of falling into a type of generosity as malefic as that of the oppressors. That generosity of the oppressors is nourished by an unjust order, which must be maintained in order to justify that generosity. Our converts, on the other hand, truly desire to transform the unjust order, but because of their background, they believe that they must be the executors of the transformation. They talk about the people, but they do not trust them. And trust in the people is the indispensable precondition for revolutionary change. A real humanist can be identified more by his trust in the people, which engages him in their struggle, than by 1,000 actions in their favor without the trust. Those who authentically commit themselves to the people must re-examine themselves constantly. This conversion is so radical as not to allow of ambiguous behavior. To affirm this commitment but to consider oneself the appropriator of revolutionary wisdom, which must be given to or imposed on the people, is to retain the old ways. The man or woman who proclaims devotion to the cause of liberation, yet is unstable to enter into communion with the people, whom he or she continues to regard as totally ignorant, is grievously self-deceived. The convert who approaches the people but feels alarm at each step they take, each doubt they express, and each suggestion they offer, and attempts to impose his status, remains nostalgic towards his origins. Conversion to the people requires a profound rebirth. Those who undergo it must take on a new form of existence. They can no longer remain as they were. Only through comradeship with the oppressed can the converts understand their characteristic ways of living and behaving, which in diverse moments reflect the structure of domination. One of these characteristics is the previously mentioned existential duality of the oppressed, who are at the same time themselves and the oppressor whose image they have internalized. Accordingly, until they concretely discover the oppressor and in turn their own consciousness, they nearly always express fatalistic attitudes towards their situation. The peasant begins to get courage to overcome his dependence when he realizes that he is dependent. Until then, he goes along with the boss and says, "What can I do? I'm only a peasant." When superficially analyzed, this fatalism is sometimes interpreted as a docility that is a trait of national character. Fatalism is the guise of docility is the fruit of an historical and sociological situation, not an essential characteristic of a people's behavior. It almost always is related to the power of destiny or fate or fortune, inevitable forces, or to a distorted view of God. Under this way of magic and myth, the oppressed, especially the peasants who are almost submerged in nature, see their suffering, the fruit of exploitation, as the will of God, as if God were the creator of this organized disorder. Submerged in reality, the oppressed cannot perceive clearly the order which serves the interests of the oppressors whose image they have internalized. Chafing under the restrictions of this order, they often manifest a type of horizontal violence, striking out at their own comrades for the pettiest reasons. The colonized man will first manifest the aggressiveness which has been deposited in his bones against his own people. This is the period when the niggers beat each other up, and the police and magistrates do not know which way to turn when faced with the astonishing waves of crime in North America, while the settler or the policeman has the right the livelong day to strike the native, to insult him and to make him cruel to them. You will see the native reaching for his knife at the slightest hostile or aggressive glance cast on him by another native, for the last resort of the native is to defend his personality vis-a-vis his brother. It is possible that in this behavior they are once more manifesting their duality, because the oppressor exists within their oppressed comrades. When they attack those comrades, they are indirectly attacking the oppressor as well. On the other hand, at a certain point in their existential experience, the oppressed feel an irresistible attraction towards the oppressors and their way of life. Sharing this way of life becomes an overpowering aspiration. In their alienation, the oppressed want at any cost to resemble the oppressors, to imitate them, to follow them. This phenomenon is especially prevalent in the middle-class oppressed who yearn to be equal to the eminent men and women of the upper class. Albert Memmi, in an exceptional analysis of the colonized mentality, refers to the contempt he felt towards the colonizer, mixed with passionate attraction towards him. How could he hate the colonizers and yet admire them so passionately? Self-depreciation is another characteristic of the oppressed, which derives from the internalization of the opinion the oppressors hold of them. So often do they hear that they are good for nothing, know nothing, and are incapable of learning anything, that they are sick, lazy, and unproductive, that in the end they become convinced of their own unfitness. The peasant feels inferior to the boss because the boss seems to be the only one who knows things and is able to run things. They call themselves ignorant and say the professor is the one who has knowledge and to whom they should listen. The criteria of knowledge imposed upon them are the conventional ones. "Why don't you," said a peasant participating in a culture circle, "explain the pictures first? That way it'll take less time and won't give us a headache." Almost never do they realize they to know things. They are learned in their relations with the world and with other women and men. Given the circumstances which have produced their duality, it is only natural that they distrust themselves. Not infrequently, peasants in educational projects begin to discuss a generative theme in a lively manner, then stop suddenly and say to the educator, "Excuse us, we ought to keep quiet and let you talk. You are the one who knows, we don't know anything." They often insist that there is no difference between them and the animals. When they do admit a difference, it favors the animals. They are freer than we are. It is striking, however, to observe how this self-depreciation changes with the first changes in the situation of oppression. I heard a peasant leader say in an asentamiento meeting, "They used to say we were unproductive because we were lazy and drunkards. All lies. Now that we are respected as men, we are going to show everything that we were never drunkards or lazy. We were exploited." As long as their ambiguity persists, the oppressed are reluctant to resist and totally lack confidence in themselves. They have a diffuse, magical belief in their invulnerability and power of the oppressor. The magical force of the landowner's power holds particular sway in the rural areas. A sociologist friend of mine tells of a group of armed peasants in a Latin American country who recently took over an latifundium. For tactical reasons, they planned to hold the landowner as a hostage, but not one peasant had the courage to guard him. His very presence was terrifying. It is also possible that the act of opposing the boss provoked guilt feelings. In truth, the boss was inside them. The oppressed must see examples of the vulnerability of the oppressor so that a contrary conviction can begin to grow within them. Until this occurs, they will continue disheartened, fearful, and beaten. As long as the oppressed remain unaware of the causes of their condition, they fatalistically accept their exploitation. Further, they are apt to react in a passive and alienated manner when confronted with the necessity to struggle for their freedom and self-affirmation. Little by little, however, they tend to try out forms of rebellious action. In working towards liberation, one must neither lose sight of this passivity nor overlook the moment of awakening. Within their unauthentic view of the world and of themselves, the oppressed feel like things owned by the oppressor. For the latter, to be is to have, almost always at the expense of those who have nothing. For the oppressed, at a certain point in their existential experience, to be is not to resemble the oppressor, but to be under him, to depend on him. Accordingly, the oppressed are emotionally dependent. The peasant is a dependent. He can't say what he wants. Before he discovers his dependence, he suffers. He lets off steam at home, where he shouts at his children, beats them, and despairs. He complains about his wife and thinks everything is dreadful. He doesn't let off steam with the boss because he thinks the boss is a superior being. Lots of times, the peasant gives vent to his sorrows by drinking. This total emotional dependence can lead the oppressed to what Fromm calls necrophilic behavior, the destruction of life, their own or that of their oppressed fellows. It is only when the oppressed find the oppressor out and become involved in the organized struggle for their liberation that they begin to believe in themselves. This discovery cannot be purely intellectual, but must involve action, nor can it be limited to mere activism, but must include serious reflection. Only then will it be a praxis. Critical and liberating dialogue, which presupposes action, must be carried on with the oppressed at whatever the stage of their struggle for liberation. The content of the dialogue can and should vary in accordance with historical conditions and the level at which the oppressed perceive reality. But to substitute monologues, slogans, and communique for dialogue is to attempt to liberate the oppressed with the instruments of domestication. Attempting to liberate the oppressed without their reflective participation is the act of liberation, is to treat them as objects which must be saved from a burning building. It is to lead them into the populist pitfall and transform them into masses which can be manipulated. At all stages of their liberation, the oppressed must see themselves as women and men engaged in the ontological and historical vocation of becoming more fully human. Reflection and action become imperative when one doesn't erroneously attempt to dichotomize the content of humanity from its historical forms. The insistence that the oppressed engage in reflection on their concrete situation is not a call to armchair revolution. On the contrary, true reflection, leads to action. On the other hand, when the situation calls for action, that action will constitute an authentic praxis only if its consequences become the object of critical reflection. In this sense, the praxis is the new raison d'être of the oppressed. In the revolution, which inaugurates the historical moment of this raison d'être, is not viable apart from their concomitant conscious involvement. Otherwise, action is pure activism. To achieve this praxis, however, it is necessary to trust in the oppressed and in their ability to reason. Whoever lacks this trust will fail to initiate or will abandon dialogue, reflection, and communication, and will fall into using slogans, communique, monologues, and instructions. Superficial conversions to the cause of liberation carry this danger. Political action on the side of the oppressed must be pedagogical action in the authentic sense of the word, and therefore action with the oppressed. Those who work for liberation mustn't take advantage of the emotional dependence of the oppressed, dependence that is the fruit of the concrete situation of domination which surrounds them and which engendered their unauthentic view of the world. Using their dependence to create still greater dependence is an oppressor tactic. Libertarian action must recognize this dependence as a weak point and must attempt through reflection and action to transform it into independence. However, not even the best-intentioned leadership can bestow independence as a gift. The liberation of the oppressed is a liberation of women and men, not things. Accordingly, while no one liberates himself by his own efforts alone, neither is he liberated by others. Liberation, a human phenomenon, cannot be achieved by semi-humans. Any attempt to treat people as semi-humans only dehumanizes them. When people are already dehumanized due to the oppression they suffer, the process of their liberation must not employ the methods of dehumanization. The correct method for a revolutionary leadership to employ in the task of liberation is therefore not libertarian propaganda, nor can the leadership merely implant in the oppressed a belief in freedom, thus thinking to win their trust. The correct method lies in dialogue. The conviction of the oppressed that they must fight for their liberation is not a gift bestowed by the revolutionary leadership, but the result of their own conscientizatio. The revolutionary leaders must realize that their own conviction of the necessity for struggle, an indispensable dimension of revolutionary wisdom, was not given to them by anyone else, if it is authentic. This conviction cannot be packaged and sold. It is reached rather by means of a totality of reflection and action. Only the leader's own involvement in reality within an historical situation led them to criticize the situation and to wish to change it. Likewise, the oppressed, who do not commit themselves to the struggle unless they are convinced, and who, if they do not make such a commitment, withhold the indispensable conditions for this struggle, must reach this conviction as subjects, not as objects. They also must intervene critically in the situation which surrounds them and whose mark they bear. Propaganda cannot achieve this, while the conviction of the necessity for struggle, without which the struggle is infeasible, is indispensable to the revolutionary leadership. Indeed, it was this conviction which constituted that leadership. It is also necessary for the oppressed. It is necessary, that is, unless one intends to carry out the transformation for the oppressed rather than with them. It is my belief that only the latter form of transformation is valid. The object is present in these considerations is to defend the eminently pedagogical character of the revolution. The revolutionary leaders of every epoch who have affirmed that the oppressed must accept the struggle for their liberation, an obvious point, have also thereby implicitly recognized the pedagogical aspect of this struggle. Many of these leaders, however, perhaps due to natural and understandable biases against pedagogy, have ended up using the educational method employed by the oppressor. They deny pedagogical action in the liberating process, but they use propaganda to convince. It is essential for the oppressed to realize that when they accept the struggle for humanization, they also accept, from that moment, their total responsibility for the struggle. They must realize that they are fighting not merely for freedom from hunger, but for freedom to create and to construct, to wonder and to venture. Such freedom requires that the individual be active and responsible, not a slave or a well-fed cog in the machine. It is not enough that men are not slaves. If social conditions further the existence of automatons, the result will not be love of life, but love of death. The oppressed, who have been shaped by the death-affirming climate of oppression, must find through their struggle the way to life-affirming humanization, which does not lie simply in having more to eat, although it doesn't involve having more to eat and cannot fail to include the aspect. The oppressed have been destroyed precisely because their situation has reduced them to things. In order to regain their humanity, they must cease to be things and fight as men and women. This is a radical requirement. They cannot enter the struggle as objects in order later to become human beings. The struggle begins with men's recognition that they have been destroyed. Propaganda, management, manipulation, all arms of domination cannot be the instruments of their rehumanization. The only effective instrument is a humanizing pedagogy, in which the revolutionary leadership establishes a permanent relationship of dialogue with the oppressed. In a humanizing pedagogy, the method ceases to be an instrument by which the teachers, in this instance the revolutionary leadership, can manipulate the students, in this instance the oppressed, because it expresses the consciousness of the students themselves. The method is, in fact, the external form of consciousness manifest in acts, which takes on the fundamental property of consciousness, its intentionality. The essence of consciousness is being with the world, and this behavior is permanent and unavoidable. Accordingly, consciousness is in essence a way towards something apart from itself, outside itself, which surrounds it and which it apprehends by means of ideational capacity. Consciousness is thus, by definition, a method, in the most general sense of the word. A revolutionary leadership must accordingly practice co-intentional education. Teachers and students, leadership and people, co-intent and reality are both subjects, not only in the task of unveiling that reality and thereby coming to know it critically, but in the task of recreating that knowledge. As they attain this knowledge of reality through common reflection and action, they discover themselves as its permanent recreators. In this way, the presence of the oppressed in the struggle for their liberation will be what it should be, not pseudo-participation, but committed involvement.